In terms of the families in Korea, we've seen an increase. So 235 in 1995 have gone abroad to over 8,000 in 2005. And so obviously this is an undercount because it doesn't count the visits. So students who come to Canada during their school holidays to engage in small language programs, private institutes, and so on. And these are really the numbers that Korea has are based on student applications to the Korean government to be able to legally study abroad. And so there's an increase there. We also know, again, that students come during school holidays to study in English programs for a very short amount of time. And we also know in the recent period about 45% of CIC visas for students from Korea actually went to primary to secondary level students. So we have seen some of this increase in younger students in Canada. So why are they coming to Canada? We know that they have options of going elsewhere to study English. Why Canada? Well, one is that there are positive perceptions about Canada. We have generally low crime rates, and obviously this is in relation to the US quite often. Our public school system is of generally high quality. In the 90s and the early 2000s, our exchange rates were beneficial for Koreans coming here versus going to the United States. In 1994, the Canadian government exempted student visas for those who are coming to study at less than 6 months. So now there's a lot less red tape for people to come for short periods. And there's also been increasing contact between Canadians and educators and families in Korea. In our survey, we found about 19% of the families who had come to Canada had some contact with a Canadian or Canadian institution. And of that 19%, about 40% of the contact was with English language teachers, so Canadian teachers who are teaching in Korea. And finally, what Min Jung Kwak, who's part of our research team, considers as an educational migration industry, which is really made up of immigrant entrepreneurs from Korea who have started, for example, English language institutes, travel agencies, and educational brokerages to really facilitate migration from Korea in Canada. Okay, so the second question was, in what ways are migrants' connections with South Korea dependent on their migration strategy, and what are the implications for retaining them? So now I'm going to tell you a little bit about the survey that we're doing as part of the Toronto study. It's an in-person survey of over 400. In the sample, we have 34% transnational families. So we're comparing transnational families, or families that are separated by national borders, with families who are considered intact, so who are here as nuclear families. And in terms of the sample, we're looking at married individuals with school-aged children who arrived between 2000 and 2009. So we're examining really how transnational families compare to intact families along a number of different indicators. And today I'll show you a few of the indicators we have on transnationalism, sort of the individual level sort of indicators of transnationalism. Again, the study and the results are very preliminary. We're still working with the data, but I think we'll see some interesting findings today. I can also say that it's not a random sample, so we can't claim that they're representative of the Korean population or Korean families in Toronto, but they really do give us a good sense of sort of people's connections. Okay, in terms of the connections that are similar, so in terms of the dimensions along which transnational families and intact families are really not different, because we would expect, for transnational families to actually be more tied to Korea compared to intact migrant families. But along the cultural dimension, the civic dimension, and the social dimension, they're actually not very different. Where they are different is along the economic dimension and the emotional dimension. So intact families, which are reflected in the dark blue bar, and transnational families are reflected in the light blue bar, you can see that in terms of property, that intact families are less likely to have property in Korea, property, investment, or savings in Korea. Transnational families, over 90% have some sort of investment or savings in Korea. Along the emotional dimension, in terms of how often do you wish you were in Korea, we see slight differences as well, and they are statistically significant. The intact families, not very much, a little over 10%. Among the transnational families, slightly higher, over 20%, wish that quite often that they were in Korea. In terms of the potential for retention, the two questions that are reflected here are, one, do you plan to settle permanently in Canada? Here we see a difference among intact families. Just under 50% said yes. In terms of the question, do you expect to return to Korea, among intact families, a little less than 50%. Among transnational families, about 10% intend to settle in Canada permanently, and over 70% expect to return. What's interesting here is that actually intact families, less than 50% plan to settle in Canada permanently. We should expect that should be higher, given that they're here on a permanent basis. Okay, in terms of satisfaction, they are actually quite similar, but again, it may be not because their standards are the same, but their standards are maybe quite different in terms of how they measure their own level of satisfaction. So obviously, temporary families will be measuring their satisfaction on the basis that their stay is much more temporary, and for permanent migrants, it would be on the basis that they're here really to stay. And in terms of how happy they are with the move, whether their move was better than expected, and would they make the same decision again, the two types of families were really not that different. Okay. So in terms of my preliminary thoughts, we don't really have conclusions as of yet, since we are still working with the data. But some preliminary thoughts are that, one, there are really different ways in which Korean migrants are tied to South Korea. And really, when we talk about transnational migrants and other types of migrants, we really should be looking at the type of tie. So, for example, we didn't see a lot of differences in terms of cultural, social, and civic ties, but we did see a lot of difference along the economic dimension and the emotional dimension. And finally, the potential for migration is greater for intact families, but really it's not a certainty in an era of transnationalism. So really I want to raise a question is, what do we mean by retention when we're really in an era of transnationalism? Thank you.